Welcome to part 4 of African political thought. Today we're going to deal with the phenomenon of the African big man. And this is a term that was applied not just to African dictators. For instance, in Haiti, Papa Doc Duvalier was regarded as a big man, even though of a very small country. It can be applied in European terms. Was someone like Field Marshal Tito, a big man in former Yugoslavia? Some of the Soviet leaders, for instance, is even today in Russia, President Putin, a big man, meaning someone who allows no obstacles to stand in his way. And the idea of the big man really was pioneered in Victorian times by Henry Stanley, the legendary explorer, particularly of Central Africa. It was he who discovered Dr. Livingstone and coined the immortal phrase, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, in what is now southern Zambia. But he also explored a very great deal of what is now Democratic Republic of Congo. A lot of it on behalf of the King of Belgium. Now, you have to put into context what it meant to be an explorer, a celebrity explorer in the days of Henry Stanley. These people would come back, they would give lectures at places like the Royal Geographical Society, and they were like rock stars. There would be a queue around the block several times, waiting to get in to listen to the lecture of the legendary explorer, bringing back tales of basically exotica as far as Victorian society was concerned. And you play to your audience. Probably the more exotic, the better, even if it means a great deal of exaggeration, and particularly the exaggeration between black and white and the capacities of both. So that the term heart of darkness was probably not coined by Joseph Conrad. It was probably something that derived from lectures of this sort. And Henry Stanley was legendary in more than one way, very much as the big man who let no obstacle stand in his path. He coined the term Bulamutari, or rather the term was coined by his native bearers and porters after his habit. Bulamutari, the one who smashes the rocks, by his expedient. Whenever he came to a river with rapids in it and he couldn't ford the river, he would simply blow up the rocks. And this idea of letting no obstacle stand in your way was probably a key part of the history of now Democratic Republic of Congo. Shortly, the Belgian Congo in the wake of Stanley, because at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85 that divided up Africa among the colonial powers, then Belgium got what is now Democratic Republic of Congo. So the Belgian Congo, except that for many years it wasn't actually the property of the Belgian state. It was the property of the Belgian king. And the tales of ransack, the tales of exploitation, the tales of the rush to obtain the mineral resources of this part of Africa, no matter what the human cost, and the human cost was very, very significant. That is a view of the colonial process most epitomized by what happened in Congo. It got so bad that in the early part of the 20th century, even the Belgian parliament basically demanded that the territory be ceded to the state, the Belgian state, rather than remain in the hands of the king. But you have to, again, remember what this meant in terms of Europe, because prior to acquiring Congo, Belgium was one of the poorest parts of Europe. Small country with its own divisions, which continue to a certain extent to this day, And the colonial acquisition of Belgium basically transformed its fortunes. It became a financial center. Basically, the income levels of Belgian citizens rose almost exponentially. So they were in no mood to decolonize, and certainly it was well before the era of decolonization. But in terms of acquiring the benefits of the colonies, they certainly weren't in any hurry to spend money to develop those colonies. It was all very much acquisition for the sake of Belgium. And celebrity explorers like Stanley added to all of this by his tales exoticized of the native as curiously not fully human. So the lack of development of human resources, of infrastructure for human development, that accompanied Congo through to independence in 1960. A huge country with a huge lack of development of infrastructure, of personnel, and of a very, very great determination on the part of Belgium to retain access to the mineral wealth in the country that was meant to be decolonized. So it basically gave rise in the early part of the 1960s to the entire modern image of Africa as being A, ungovernable, and B, savage. A very great deal of early, particularly American political science, based on what happened in Congo and some of the surrounding areas. Articles like Aristide Zolberg's famous piece on the ungovernability of Africa, that entered academic discourse almost as if it were an evident truism. And indeed, the chaos that surrounded the early days of the Congo as an independent entity, with war and bloodshed and assassinations, was something that seemed to fulfill those kinds of dire descriptions of the new state. And indeed, assassinations began 1 year after independence in 1961. The founding Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, who was entered into a kind of left, as it were, legend because he was regarded as having been assassinated because of his desire to begin a nationalization of the mineral resources in Congo. And the great powers, or at least the great corporations, or the great powers in concert with the great corporations, decided that they could not lose such a source of wealth, or they did not even want to negotiate shares of such a great source of wealth. So the jury is still out on who assassinated Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba didn't leave behind a great body of writing. He left behind the idea of a socialism articulated pretty much along Western Marxist lines. And for that reason, he was pretty readily adopted by the Marxist and the associated left in Europe, and became, in the manner of these things, something like a symbol, something like a martyr figure in contemplations of Africa, even by people who knew very little else about Africa. So his assassination, probably at the hands, but we don't really know for sure, there's still a lot of controversy about this, at the hands of some kind of linkage between Belgium and the CIA in the United States. That is something which, of course, added to the idea of an Africa as the target of exploitation by the capitalist West. More assassinations followed in 1961, and of course the one that is most resonant for the international community was, and I do call it an assassination, some people still insist that it was an accident, but the death in any case of the United Nations Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, who was one of my very early heroes. He was a Secretary General who had a certain caliber which has never been replicated. The great powers on the Security Council, all of them, have never wanted to have someone with his capacities and his determination to bypass the Security Council. He made recourse to the General Assembly with regard to the introduction of peacekeeping. He invented peacekeeping. And this bypassing of the Security Council of the five great powers of the day, his appeal to the wider body of the General Assembly, and his sense of the Secretary General himself having a range of executive powers, that was too much. It was felt by the great powers. So he was mediating in the Congo crisis when his plane mysteriously crashed above the skies of Ndola, one of the northern Zambian cities near the border with Congo. And there are all kinds of people coming forward now, saying, I did it, I did it. People, rogue pilots and fighter aircraft. Don't forget the whole area was littered with mercenary forces of one sort or another by this point in time. And it's almost as if everyone wants to have their 15 minutes of fame. Or they've been put up to say these things because there's still a need to disguise the perpetrators of the assassination, who may well have been either the Americans or the Soviets, because Dag Hammarskjöld was getting in their way. Even so, one of the most moving memorials that I've ever seen was constructed by the Zambian authorities. Kenneth Kaunda greatly admired Dag Hammarskjöld as a person of peace. And when you read his poetry, he was a published poet, he was friends with the great poets of his day, then you can see his inner musings about the desire for peace and the psychological cost of someone striving in his position towards a world of peace. It became not just psychological strivings, of course, it led to his death. But if you fly above Ndola today, you'll see that there's a shrine built by the Zambians to Dag Hammarskjöld, and for hundreds of meters around the shrine in every single direction, they've planted Swedish pine. For Hammarskjöld was Swedish in his origin. And the touching nature of this memorial is something which moves me every time I'm flying in that area and I see a well-maintained memorial. The trees are still there, a tribute to a man who tried to bring peace to what was regarded as the dark heart of Africa. Now, all of this owed to a quest, a lust for access to the mineral resources, probably involved in the death of Patrice Lumumba, but lurking in the background was someone who had been spotted at an early stage of the independence process, in fact by the Americans. He impressed at embassy parties. This was Mobutu, who later became president, lurking in the background until a few years after the death of Lumumba. Many felt he was in one way or another deeply involved. By that stage, a rising young officer, one of the very rare talents, not only in government but in the army, but not an educated talent. The Belgians had never bothered to develop him or any other member of the armed forces to any kind of high level. Certainly, again, as in Zambia, very few degree holders, but a country which was much vaster, which was more complex, with even more languages, something like 240 different languages, and essentially ungovernable in terms of the vastness of its terrain and the lack of communications and transport infrastructure. To this day, that's a problem in what we now call Democratic Republic of Congo. So when Mobutu finally assumed power, it was pretty much on the cards that he would try to forge a unity by sheer violence. In other words, do as I say or you're going to die. At the same time, because of the lack of infrastructure for development, the money that was gained from the mining industry, went to a large extent to line his own pockets and that of his family. The term state kleptomania was basically applied in the first instance to Mobutu. At one stage, the holdings of himself and his family were estimated to be as great as the national debt. And because the country was mismanaged by his government, that national debt was several billions. At one stage, about $6 billion US, which in the 1970s and its elision into the 1980s was a huge amount in terms of what any country would be owing. And his personal accumulation again gave rise to almost, as it were, fulfillment of the neo-Marxist sense of a sliding scale of accumulation, first at the local level, feeding up into chains of global accumulation. And for that, read Mobutu and his family at the local levels and the great mining corporations and the great capitalist powers higher up in the hierarchical feeding chain. So a very great deal of almost tropes seem to be evidenced and fulfilled in the case of Congo, what Mobutu came to call Zaire, a local term for the great river that swallows all rivers, and a sense of grandiosity sprang up around both Mobutu and his sense of how he portrayed or tried to portray Zaire, the great river that swallows all rivers, and he himself adopted a string of ceremonial names. Basically, if you try to translate his full set of ceremonial names, it translates as something like the great warrior who overcomes all of his enemies without mercy and leaves them drowning in rivers of fire behind him and in his wake. Well, that's a pretty long description of oneself. It also depicted himself by his adoption of such names as someone perhaps not exactly given to a sense of self which was, let us say, gentle, and let us say reaching out to his fellow human beings and indeed his fellow citizens. And his sense of grandiosity extended to the fact that in terms of television programs, and in the old days, television had to shut down at a certain time every evening. And so at shutdown time, what you would have in most countries would be the national anthem. You had that in terms of Zaire, the river that swallows all rivers, but you also had an image of Mobutu himself on a cloud, dressed as an angel, and riding on this cloud, descending to earth to give the benefactions of heaven. So that the image was one of Mobutu as God's gift to Zaire. In terms of the international image, what you had probably most resonantly was the 1974 Rumble in the Jungle, the world boxing title match, heavyweight boxing, between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. And this was meant to be a showcase of a modern production in a modern African city. And every single effort was made for this public relations purpose, but the capital city was a scene of great urban crime at that point in time. Mobutu ensured there was going to be no crime and nobody attacking the visiting tourists and cameramen and journalists by the simple expedient of going to the main prison and executing, or having executed 200 prisoners, whether they were guilty of a capital crime or not. And that was a pretty direct warning to all would-be perpetrators of criminal activity. Don't try this while the circus is in town. So that the great boxing match was actually premised on a slaughter, basically almost on a necrophilia. To say that Mobutu not only did not shirk at killing, but was quite fond of it, is something which is, of course, a very controversial statement. but he himself often said he had to set an example in deaths so that others would not try to do anything against him or his regime. It's this particular image, necrophiliac image, that most informs the thinking, I think, of the great intellectual, African intellectual Achille Mbembe, and his basic proposition that there's the politics of the necropolis. In other words, there's the politics of death. And that in so many African jurisdictions, so many of the new African states, what you have is the politics of the necropolis. In other words, the development of a metropolis is often accompanied or facilitated, as in the case of Zaire, by the construction of a necropolis. Mbembe, of course, articulates this theory in a complex way, but it's entered again a certain kind of curious lineage from the early days of the Heart of Darkness through to the politics of the necropolis. And one wonders whether or not conservative thinkers all the way down to today's so-called progressive thinkers can actually perceive an Africa breaking free of this kind of negative, destitute, and murderous image. Now, to be fair momentarily to Mobutu, what he inherited was, as I said, this vast, underdeveloped terrain. He tried to hold it together by force. It largely did stay together, although again, to this day, there are contending warlords and local leaders who defy any effort by central authority to have total reign over them. The wars that have been going on now for many years, particularly in southeastern Democratic Republic of Congo, have seen, by some estimates, 2 million civilian deaths, and the large-scale use of gendercide, that is rape of women, as an instrument of war and as an instrument of domination. And it goes largely unsung because Westerners are not threatened by this carnage, and the flows of wealth continue from today's Democratic Republic of Congo, along the way lining local oligarchic pockets through to the hierarchy at the top of global capital accumulation. So you have a legacy that stretches from the colonial Belgian days through the days of Mobutu and through the successor governments who have not yet been able to divest themselves completely of this kind of heritage, their part in a genealogy of the necropolis. Perhaps Achille Mbembe was simply correct in his diagnosis, at least when it's applied to Congo. Certainly Walter Rodney, in his great book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, would be correct if his diagnosis was applied largely to Congo. Other countries, as we've been discussing, were not as rich and were decolonized in other ways, and sometimes with a far greater sense of genuine responsibility. But was all of this on the part of Mobutu done only with self-aggrandizement and without any recourse to thought? Well, no, there was thought, but articulated in its detail by intellectuals around him. And yes, he had a set of courtiers who were in fact intellectuals, highly trained in the francophonic fashion. But what Mobutu tried to do was to instigate what he called a campaign of national authenticity. Everybody, notwithstanding his depiction of himself as a Christian angel, but everybody had to divest themselves of their Christian names if they had come from a European source. He himself got rid of his name Joseph, adopted the string of laudatory appellations, but everybody had to adopt a Zairean name, and everyone had to dress in a certain way, not like an ancient native, but basically in a very, very upmarket form of the Nehru and the Mao approach to dressing, but with a sartorial elegance pioneered by Mobutu himself. In other words, the high collar, the Nehru collar or the Mao collar, sat atop a tailored jacket which was always exquisitely made. He would drape a leopard skin over one shoulder, and he would wear a leopard skin toolbox hat. I mean, I imagine for many years, and those of you who are Bob Dylan aficionados will recognize the song, Leopard Skin Toolbox Hat. I imagine for years that Bob Dylan sang that with Mobutu in mind. Of course he didn't, but it was a very, very fitting image. And this was meant to be a symbol of authenticity. So a lot of superficial emblems of authenticity, despite, as it were, the exquisite Western-style tailoring that went into making them. That itself, of course, spawned all kinds of traditions in today's Democratic Republic of Congo. The phenomenon of the sapeur, the dandy, the urban dandy, even in the slum areas of the great cities of Democratic Republic of Congo. The sartorial elegance and the importance of that one might live in a slum, but one can rise above by appearing as if one were some kind of millionaire. It owes, of course, also to hip-hop artists. It owes also to all kinds of French and Italian fashion trends. But it owes very, very much, I think, to a certain lineage that comes from the sartorial elegance of Mobutu himself. In other words, the campaign for authenticity was not a campaign without elegance. But the person who probably best articulated in more complex forms what he was trying to say was an intellectual called Mabika Kalanda. Now, he begins his diagnosis with a critique of colonialism, meaning that the Zairean or the Congolese citizen entered history, that is, entered independence, with a double deficit. There was a double deficit, one of historical consciousness. Where do we fit in the world? Were we asked to fit into the world during the colonial days, or were we just an adjunct to the world as a provider of richness and materials to a greater world, a superior world out there? So a deficit of historical consciousness and of historical conscience, because there was no conscience in what King Leopold tried to inflict upon Congo. And the double deficit also included a lack of national consciousness. In other words, what goes into the formation of the Congolese or the Zairean citizen? What is the history, the immediate past history that allows for the formation of a citizen of a modern state? That national consciousness is not there. And what Mobutu tried to do through his campaign of authenticity was at least to inculcate some national consciousness. But according to Kalanda, both historical conscience and national conscience, historical consciousness and national consciousness, these are concepts to do with cultural awakening. If you don't have a cultural awakening, people cannot exist in dignity and freedom. And if the first step is simply to adopt the outer artifacts of a new culture, it all the same is meant to resonate with some sense of memory of a previous culture that had been totally disrupted by a savage colonialism, then someone like Kalanda appreciated what it was that Mobutu was trying to do. By such symbols, one masters one's destiny. One becomes an actor in history. The crisis of conscience is, and this is very, very francophonic rhetoric, the crisis of culture is a crisis of man. Only by creating the new man, and this is resonant, is it not, of our discourse on what Kaunda, what Nyerere, and above all what Kwame Nkrumah tried to do, but without quite the range of complex philosophical efforts that those three people put into the frame, But all the same, the crisis of man meant the invention of a new man, founded as closely as possible on the imagination and the memory of the old man, but going forward into a future where a national consciousness would be able to have a powerful voice in the international consciousness. It was rhetorical, it was declaratory, it was incredibly aspirational and idealistic. Its expression in intellectual terms by people like Banda was very much with the grand rhetorical gesture of much of francophonic essay writing, philosophical essay writing, for instance. Basically, not so much the kind of dense philosophy of someone like Sartre, but someone with the sweeping essayesque rhetoric of someone like Albert Camus. So intellectual currents were not absent in the intellectual circles of Zaire, but very, very much put to the purpose of the campaign for authenticity. It may have been something which was highly convenient for Mobutu. It was something which was believed by many people. So the idea of the new man echoes all kinds of other efforts of the new man throughout Africa. It even echoes what Frantz Fanon said. Fanon wrote that if culture is the manifestation of national consciousness, then basically it works two ways. National consciousness becomes the most elaborate form of culture. It's a circle, a convenient circle, but national consciousness and national culture, in Fanon's view, go hand in hand. One basically is not possible without the other. So the idea of the new African man in Mobutu's sense was to impose a new African culture, not only upon Zaire, but as an exemplar to the rest of the world. If he accomplished this simply by sartorial means, well, that's one thing. What he left in his wake was, of course, a country which was destitute, underdeveloped, despite the huge amount of wealth that was in the soil of Zaire, which had been plundered first by the Belgians and then plundered by himself. And yet this was put up with for year after year by the Americans. Don't forget, in the Cold War years, there was great contestation for influence on the part of the superpowers in Africa. The Soviets were there, the Chinese were there, the Americans were there. Angola was where the Cold War turned hot. And one of the Angolan liberation factions fighting against the Portuguese was hosted in Zaire by Mobutu, with covert US support. And then, of course, when the Soviets moved in and supported their faction, in the wake of the civil war at independence, then the Americans were supporting two rival factions, both the one operating out of Zaire, and of course the UNITA faction operating out of the southern part of Angola, later supported in great strength by the South African Army, with the South African Army incurring itself with tanks and mobile columns into Angola to be resisted finally successfully by a Cuban army. So the Cold War became hot in a big way in Africa. And of course, there's much overlapping between Angola and Zaire, Congo. The Queen of Congo, whom we've discussed with some of you, was very, very much the queen of a kingdom called Congo with a K, which included a large part of today's Angola, but also a part of what is today's Democratic Republic of Congo. It was an ancient kingdom which had intercourse with the outside world, chiefly with the Vatican. The correspondence, the diplomatic correspondence, remains in the Vatican archives. But what you had in terms of the colonial experience proper, after efforts at resistance against the outside colonizers fell away, what you had in the case of the Belgian Congo was desecration and deprivation of resources to the local population. A tradition was continued in which the citizen was regarded as the raw material of the state, and this raw material could be molded according to the needs of the state. If the state was personalized in the form of its president and its family, then basically that was a sort of personalized kleptomania, which, despite all kinds of trappings of attempted thought and authenticity, demarcated at least an epoch of darkness, perhaps, in the heart of Africa. 242 languages, as I say, something like a small number of national languages, French, and 11 national languages drawn from these 242 vernaculars. But even so, it meant that you could never unify the country in terms of language alone. So with all of these different language groups, bespeaking ethnic groups, the lack of an efficacious central government, but one determined on the acquisition of wealth only for a small part of the population, then the growth of warlords and warlord cultures and local cultures, local militias, local rebel groups, it makes Democratic Republic of Congo today something which seems at first sight as ungovernable, no longer necessarily the site of superpower struggle, certainly the site of local power struggle. So the Southeast Congo conflict of which I spoke, the Rwandans are in there, the Ugandans are in there. At one stage there was a continental war in which those two, plus the Eritreans, plus the Zimbabweans, and one or two others were very heavily involved with their armies. So the site of contestation, the site of wealth, because for a long time Mugabe bought off his generals by allowing them to plunder the wealth of that part of Congo to which they had been sent, supposedly to stabilize the terrible situation that arose after the fall of Mobutu, but which in fact served to cement the power of warlords, one who became president, Kabila, but also served to cement Mugabe's own power by allowing his generals free rein over the mining resources, including, it is said, the current president of Zimbabwe. In my work in the immigration tribunals of the United Kingdom, I've defended Zimbabwean refugees who were soldiers who deserted because they couldn't bear to see the oligarchs from Zimbabwe benefiting from the spoils of war, which these soldiers had been sent to guard, and asking themselves, therefore, the question, am I risking my life for the sake of this person's self-aggrandizement and his personal wealth? So you had, as it were, a continental participation in this stage of the development of what is now Democratic Republic of Congo. There is thought that comes out of Democratic Republic of Congo, or at least its earlier iterations. People like Valentin Mudimbe, one of the great original thinkers, talks about an African gnosis, a knowledge, a self-knowledge, which is immanent and has not yet appeared in its full articulation, its full complexity, something that lies at the heart of Africa, which is not a heart of darkness, but which could, when allowed to come into being, when encouraged to come into being, could be fully illuminating. And the work of Mudimbe is an intellectual beacon to say what is possible, despite what seem at first glance to be terrible conditions. Now, even underneath the rule of a big man, somebody who just blows up everything in his path, if thought of one sort, either serving the regime or thought that looks towards a more luminous Africa, if that is able to emerge, then you have, as it were, a contradictory legacy, you have an antidote to a simple view of the necropolis. You have, as it were, a contradiction at the heart of Africa, and an intellectual contradiction at the heart of Africa. All of this contrasts to a certain extent with what happened in nearby Malawi. It was called Nyasaland during the colonial days. It was part of the Rhodes corporate colonial outreach, centered in South Africa but extending north through Zimbabwe, southern Rhodesia, Zambia, what was called northern Rhodesia, and the Takan of Nyasaland. Hastings Banda, the first president of independent Malawi, had gained independence in 1964, and he made it into a one-party state in 1964. Hastings Banda was a medical doctor. He received his medical degrees both in Edinburgh and in the United States. He attended the 1945 Manchester Pan-African Congress, probably as the only highly conservative voice who have discussed the radical, aspirational nature of the Pan-African vision as it was articulated for the first time by the black diaspora in concert with African nationalist leaders. In all of this aspirational, progressive thinking, the vision that Hastings Banda had in mind was one which actually looked at the colonial experience as providing models for development. Highly conservative man. When he went back as the leader of the independence movement, he couldn't speak the dominant local language, Chirawa. It's a language which crosses over the border into the eastern part of Zambia and is one of the main languages of Zambia, where it's called Chinyanja. Just like in the case of Swahili, what you have are regional differences in the way that it's spoken. And just as when the Tanzanians drove out Idi Amin from Uganda, and I asked some of Amin's soldiers, what did the Tanzanians bring that defeated you so easily? And they said they came upon us with language like lords, basically a very high form of articulation, which by speech alone overawed many of the Ugandan people fighting for Amin. What you have, of course, is Chirawa, often called by the Zambians Deepi Chirawa. That is deep Chirawa, deep language, Oxford English, if you like. But Hastings Banda couldn't speak any of this. And his vision of an independent country was to make it more British. One of the few countries to enter into diplomatic relations with South Africa. The South Africans, underneath apartheid, were delighted and poured money into the country. The construction of the new capital, Lilongwe, largely South African money. The construction of huge granaries, one of the first in Africa where you could store an entire season's harvest, probably all owing to South African money. But notwithstanding the great, as it were, imprint that British culture had made upon Hastings Banda, so that rather than setting off to build a new university for national purposes, as Kenneth Kaunda did, his idea was to build an academy which was to be the Eton of Africa. In other words, the curriculum was exactly the same as Eton's. You went there to learn Latin. Well, I've got nothing against people learning Latin. I would very, very much hope they would also learn things like agronomy, because Malawi remains to this day one of the poorest countries in Africa, certainly on that side of Africa. There are no mineral resources there. It's got beautiful bird life. That's really about its major tourist attraction. And it has a beautiful lake. The border between Malawi and Tanzania is demarcated by that lake, but no one knows exactly where in that lake is the border. So little local gunship standoffs from time to time. in the history of the two countries. But in trying to forge a unity among Malawians, then the one-party state used a paramilitary group called the Young Pioneers. They slaughtered, in Mobutu style, don't forget, it's a neighboring country, they slaughtered opposition, even people that you would regard as perhaps annoying from time to time, but essentially harmless, people like Jehovah's Witnesses. Thousands of them fled to Zambia, where with religious tolerance and ecumenicalism they were welcomed, and indeed are still welcome. But something like, and it's hard to lay an exact figure on this, but something like 7,000 of them were killed in cold blood by the Young Pioneers. And their only crime being that they would not salute the flag of Malawi, claiming that they owed allegiance to the kingdom of heaven in the first instance. They weren't opposing the state, give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, but give to God that which is God's. But that was enough to make them the victims of a lack of toleration on the part of Hastings Banda. And what happened to the witnesses was simply emblematic of what happened to many, many other people. In 1981, I had two good colleagues at the University of Zambia in the law department, Orton and Vera Chirwa. Basically, one day, they were both, as it were, Malawian exiles, political exiles. One day they were just kidnapped, taken back to Malawi. Orton died under these atrocious conditions in prison. Vera was finally released in 1994. And I saw her after her release, marked but curiously not bitter. She forgave her oppressors despite so many years in terrible prison conditions. Bespeaking a thread that runs through a lot of that part of Central Africa, Malawi, as well as I said, particularly Zambia, where the decolonial project has got to reckon with what to do about the deep embeddedness of Christianity and fundamental Christological values to do with things like forgiveness. But also, of course, the prisoners of Hastings Banda could express their feelings of defiance through things like poetry. So one of the great poets, of course, he's now also been released from prison in Malawi, Jack Mapanje, wrote a number of books of poetry, some have won international prizes, and one of his most famous books is called Skipping Without Ropes. And this is something he wrote in prison. The title poem, Skipping Without Ropes, I'll read you a couple of verses from it. I will skip without your rope, since you say I should not. I cannot borrow your son's skipping rope to exercise my limbs. I will skip without your rope. As you say, even the lace I want will hang my neck until I die. I will create my own rope, my own hope, and skip without rope. Well, you can see the defiance that went into the opposition to Hastings Banda, someone who should have served as a reminder to other gerontocratic leaders of Africa that you should let go simply for the sake of your self-dignity, because it was quite clear that in his closing years, when he insisted on remaining president, he would attend international summits as the president of Malawi, clearly incontinent. So there are, as it were, moments when the body tells you that you should let go, but you yourself, in your own heart, perhaps a heart of darkness, cannot let go. Malawi has had a succession of difficult leaders underneath multi-party democracy since those days. The second female president of Africa, Joyce Banda, had a relatively unsuccessful tenure of power, a single term. One of the good things is that those who contested her victory in elections. They tried to overthrow her in coups, but the army would not do anything unconstitutional. So signs of progress there. But a contradiction again. In an Africa where many people were seeking authenticity, and Hastings Banda stands out as a big man of a small country, so a little big man, who saw the new African man as a rival to the European man along European lines, but without, as it were, mercy in terms of how he dealt with his opponents. Basically, an apostle of the necropolis. And the thought that was articulated, unlike in Zaire, was not, as it were, a contradiction of thought that looked beyond, but at the same time thought that could be said to support what was going on in terms of supporting the authentication campaign, the authenticity campaign of Mobutu. I can't trace any thought that supported Banda, because how can you think towards the new African man if, in fact, you're trying to recreate a European man in Africa, in an Africa without resources, for instance? So a contradiction there. And the thought that exists is in the thought of poets, I will skip without rope, and in the thought of academics finally released after many years in prison. And notwithstanding the number of years that Vera spent in prison and the fact that Orton, the husband, was essentially tortured to death, so he died in prison, both deaf and blind. The thought that relates to forgiveness, the Christological vision of forgiving your enemies, the Christian gospel sense of what it means to be a complete person of God. The new person, the new man, the new woman is one of forgiveness. In this contradiction, you have two of the countries of Central Africa very much sharing traits, the big man being one of them, very much sharing the felt need to assassinate, kill, massacre opponents, very much sharing the trait of having a centralized president personifying power and statehood in the person and the personality of the president. And in both cases, pursuing this despite sacrificing the development of the bulk of the citizens of that particular country. So contradictions, one writ large, one writ small, but very, very much, as I say, ladies and gentlemen, atypical in the histories, the intellectual histories of Africa that we've studied so far. So the question that one poses in conclusion is a question which looks towards next week's lecture. What happens when the big man is in uniform and is able not just to kill opponents, but to do it on a mass scale because he commands the army? What about military rulers? Can they be a force simply for the necropolis, or can they be, in some cases at least, a force for good? What about idealistic young officers, like the idealistic young Portuguese officers that overthrew the fascist dictatorship in Portugal and gave independence to the Portuguese colonies? Those who had benefited from discussions with fellow students like Cabral, who had come to Lisbon to study. Are there contradictions apparent also in the thought and the deeds of the military big man? Is the military big man in some ways unavoidable? In the wake of the way that the Belgians colonized and ransacked Congo, and in the wake of superpower interest for material benefits as well as strategic benefits against the communist powers during the Cold War, in the wake of all of those was Mobutu inevitable? Are people creations of their historical and international circumstances, or can thought actually take a country forward If thought, does it have to be progressive thought, achieved in a single generation by a single person? If authenticity, what about an authentic national thought that springs from the people? And that asks a question which we will certainly be discussing in the second part of this lecture course. So for now, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.